Hello again, and welcome to another of Mosaic's coffee breaks. Mosaic is, of course, a collaboration of the organisations shown at the front of this presentation, and that collaboration focuses very much on the ownership issues associated with mid-market law firms. And when we say ownership, we mean everything associated with ownership, mergers and acquisitions, partnership structures, succession planning, partner exits, and everything associated with all of those issues. I hope you enjoy this broadcast.
Everyone, and welcome to the latest Mosaic Coffee Break with our guest today, Alex Hutchinson. Looking forward to talking to you, Alex. We have the full Mosaic complement here today. We've got plenty of questions ready for Alex. And firstly, Alex, what I'd like you to do is give our viewers a little bit of a potted bio, who you are, what you do. And then I think it'd be really nice to talk about how what you do fits in with our work in mergers and acquisitions.
Sure. So as a kind of brief potted background then, so I've spent the last 6 years or so working as a freelance IT director for law firms. And more recently, I've started now building that into a practice to help specific types of firms with specific IT-related challenges. So freelance IT director is somebody that comes in on a day rate, helping the law firms that don't typically need a full-time IT director, but they have a strategic challenge or problem that they want to address. So that can be changing a case management system, cybersecurity, infrastructure providers, IT suppliers, software, covers quite a broad spectrum. And what's happened over time is I've built a methodology to how you approach these projects that makes it successful for law firms. And I'm now in a position where I'm running a practice that's helping them with specific profiles of projects really around the software and systems that they use day to day.
Fascinating. And obviously one of the areas where strategic input on IT is required when we're involved in mergers and acquisitions is in integrating typically migrating one system onto the acquirer's system. And that involves all sorts of challenges around data migration and so on. Is that a field that you do a bit of work in?
Yes, it is, yeah. So typically that would be part of a project cycle. So if somebody was selecting a system, they would start at phase, let's call it phase 1 to 6. I won't bore you with the details at the moment, but they would have to go through understanding what their current needs are, select a new system. Once you've done that, it feels like you've achieved a huge amount, but you're only about halfway through. You've then got to tailor the new system for those needs and then move all of the data across from the existing system. So when a merger or acquisition takes place, I tend to come in and help them. They already know what the new system is because it's probably the alpha firm that has that, if we call it that. They have existing systems in place. What they really need to do is effectively, compliantly, and sensibly move that data into that new system and then allow for training so that people can actually use that new system.
Acting on the sale of a firm at the moment, and we had heads of terms sorted out before Christmas, and we're moving towards completion. Can you talk to us about timescale of when you should get involved in terms of the practicalities of merging the data and getting it all working so it can be ready for go live date on merger date?
Yeah, and I think the reality is I will say a time frame that I would like. The firm's priorities will be vastly different because there's a lot of moving parts to that type of work. And the same once the paperwork's signed, then you're only part way through, aren't you? There's then a number of things that it triggers. So what I would say is, in an ideal world, it would be raised as a key priority once the deal is officially complete. You have the people aspect. I'm sure there's a financial aspect and a kind of culture, but IT and technology would be something on there. Now, it might not happen straight away, but those conversations should certainly happen very soon after, because what happens is you are best to make progress towards these things each week. You will typically have an exit time frame with if we call it the alpha, the acquirer, and then the person that has sold the firm. If you want to move away from their case management system, they will have timelines, software agreements in place, maybe an annual renewal. You need to understand when they are critically, because that will impact your timeline.
4 months is a typical timescale from start to finish of pressing go and then actually getting the systems in place.
In terms of data migration, that's reasonable, yeah. And it obviously depends on the size and scale of the firm per se doesn't necessarily matter, but the number of practice areas can. But it's also about it's also what happens after that data's moved as well. So again, data migration is one piece. From a technology project, you want to make sure that you've got the time to test it all, prepare it, test it. You've got the right technical skills in place, because how are we going to get that data out? How do we need to reconfigure it then so it can go into the new system? And I can talk to you about a case study in a minute where we've come across problems with that. But once it's then in that new system, you need to factor in that they need to understand how to operate in that new system. They need training as well. So that needs to be factored into this go live date. You don't want them just to do the data migration piece, then they land in on a Monday morning and they've not really been prepared on how to use that new system. So the migration is one piece of a project typically.
Alex, picking up this theme, I certainly agree with Howard and Mark that I've seen deals in the past. In fact, I've got one right now where it's sort of ready to go, but we're deliberately pushing the completion date for a couple of months because the poor IT director just said, I have not got enough cabling in the building. I just can't do this. And so that's, has moved the entire timeline. But yeah. I've also seen the reverse, where particularly very acquisitive firms have done sort of dual or triple running. So they've completed the transaction and not migrated the data and ran systems sort of in parallel and then slowly brought them together, perhaps over 12 or 18 months. My guess is that whilst that worked beautifully for the person in my chair, it's horrendous for the person in your chair. Is that right?
Not necessarily. The thing is it's probably been a decision to manage that migration, and in my opinion, this is a personal opinion, not a technology opinion. The less time you've got running separate as entities, the better in terms of an ROI for going through this, a merger or an acquisition in the first place. But there may be that there's some other decisions that lead to why that needs to take place. It might be to do with the contracts. Might be to do with what's going on in that main system. There'd have to be a business case to why to delay it normally. So whenever I involve myself in these projects, or when I'm selected to manage them, I'm coming at it still from that IT director's point of view. So we look at a lay of the landscape. Where are we trying to get to? Where are we trying to go from? What's the skills capability? And let's get some knowledge around how do we get the data out of that system? What does it look like? How can we get it into the system? And it's like your stepping stones. And if your stepping stones all line up and the plan's there, you then start to move through them. But if you've got key missing pieces that can't happen, then you can't have disruption and risk that comes into it. You shouldn't do with any project, but you definitely can't with people in a regulated practice and things like that.
Question there, Alex. Is it actually possible to move anything to anything, or is there ever a scenario where the acquired firm is using some ancient piece of software that just isn't compatible, or
in principle it is possible, because you get the data out. So I'll give you an example. At the moment we've got data that's coming out of an old system with a client that's in something called a progress database. It's not that old, but we can't do much with it in that current state. So it's going to be transferred into a SQL database. We've then got control of that, and we can map it and move it into the right. So the data's still integral. It's the integrity of the data is still there, and there's a lot more flexibility now around that. But it's an extra step, and it means that there's extra complexity that has to be checked. Everything has to be checked for it to move through that state. But in principle now it's more possible than it used to be. It kind of goes to a middle area where you then need to realign and map that data. One of the biggest risks is it's around it's responsibilities of the suppliers or software partners that are involved, and where they see that limit. So I've had a scenario where I've been brought in. They've already made a decision. They've already selected a case management system as such, because it was through an acquisition. So we've got our state that we're going to bring it into. We want to move data from there to here. It's going to be very simple because everyone said it will be nice and straightforward, which is always an alarm bell to me, because you know, in principle, you've got to have your eye on everything, otherwise it doesn't walk itself over the line, like anything doesn't that's of value, really. So I was brought in to have a conversation with the software provider that was moving the data into their system, and we had the head of ops on this meeting, a couple of other technical people, and these conversations were taking place about the types of data that was being moved. And at one point, they just raised that, anything that's already been billed is not moving into the system. It's only unbilled data that's actually going to be moved across. And so I asked a couple of questions about the client and office account, where the data was moving. And then the conversation naturally evolved into kind of the emails and documents part as well. Oh no, that's not coming over. It's the unbilled time, you know, the unbilled disbursements. And there was huge gaps in terms of the data was physically being put into the new system. Can we get all that data out? Question one, yes. Can we set up the new system? Yes. What's going into that new system? There was huge gaps. And that's when it causes this sprint of a project, which is not, I mean, you get paid to do the work, but it's not an ideal scenario. You've got to then get around everything. You've got a checklist of, because the finance side is often underlooked. It's often it doesn't get the same priority as the case management side, and that's the biggest risk. So everybody's focused on this new system or how the fee earners are going to work and what they need for each practice area. But you've really got to be all over that financial data as well.
Because you have the issue then that until it's announced, you don't want the IT people to know about it. So you quite often can't start this consultation until fairly late in the process or even close to completion. And if you then discover that the two systems are presumably completely incompatible or are going to require this intermediate stage.
Anyway, that's all we have time for on this coffee break. Thank you very much for joining us, Alex. So it's a goodbye from everybody at Mosaic and from Alex. Thank you for watching.
That one I was referencing on the recording, you know, kind of exactly so a little bit as Mark described, you know, the poor ID director, it was like a scene from Star Trek, you know, he kind of, it lands on his desk, he's like, she cannot take it, Captain, she cannot take it.